Hi guys, welcome. Today I leaned into my silly, magical, whimsical side because today we're talking about fairies. So fae are hot. And I mean that as in they are trendy. Yes, stories about fae have been popular since forever, but I feel like the past few years there has been this trend of fae fantasy. I think if you ask anyone who really enjoys reading fantasy what they think of when you say fae, they will probably say the human-like beings with beauty beyond comparison. Elegant, like the elves from Lord of the Rings, or, well, attractive, like the A Court of Thorns and Roses fae. There are tons of people on TikTok recommending fairy smut. It's a whole genre of books about usually human girls who get abducted by very attractive fae. But if you ask a child or someone who is not really in the fantasy scene what they think of when you say fae, they are probably going to think of the small insect-like little girls like Tinkerbell or fairy godmothers from Disney, the cute little beings that help humans with their magic. I, for one, was a big Pixie Hollow fan when I was honestly a little too old. I think I was 14, 15? But how did we go from this to this to this? These are the questions the world needs answers to. Now, fae in romance fantasy settings have been around for a while. Remember during like the whole paranormal romance craze in books where everyone was like obsessed with vampires and werewolves because of Twilight? There were also a lot of books about fae love interests, but they never quite reached the same popularity as vampires or angels did. But I think a lot of you guys agree when I say that the fairy hype reached its peak and also what it looks like today when massive fantasy author Sarah J. Maas discovered fae. She is the author of the super popular Throne of Glass series, which is a young adult fantasy novel. It's a series with a varied fantasy world and many different fantasy creatures, but Sarah J. Maas introduced a fae love interest in the third book in the series, Heir of Fire, in 2014. Not even a year later, in 2015, she came out with her second series, A Court of Thorns and Roses, which was fully focused on fae. And the A Court of Thorns and Roses series, or ACOTAR for short, ACOTAR series is kind of known for becoming progressively spicier with each book, and what started out as being marketed as a young adult book ended up being, after a few books, just full-on fairy erotica. There's no way to overstate how popular Sarah J. Maas is, especially A Court of Thorns and Roses. But since then, other authors have also come out with very popular fae novels for both teen and adult audiences, notably the Cruel Prince series, the Zodiac Academy series, These Hollow Vows. I'm sure there's like many more. All including fae characters that have this super attractive humanoid appearance. Not even remotely similar to, say, like a cute little Tinkerbell that we know from our childhoods. So today I wanted to explore the evolution of the appearance of the fae and how we got to what we know them as today. We're going to talk about art, we're going to talk about folklore, and in the end I'm going to do a little comparison between the fae from The Cruel Prince and A Court of Thorns and Roses. It's gonna be fun! Before we can talk about anything regarding like the history of fae appearances, we have to establish some definitions, because I can already hear you thinking, Leonie, but aren't you talking about fairies? Aren't you talking about elves? Isn't there a difference between that and the fae? So let's get it clear. Just a quick reminder that G2A is kindly sponsoring the channel for the upcoming year, so you can always find them via my link. G2A is an online marketplace for digital products and games, and I spend a lot of my free time gaming. So whenever I want to buy something new, I like to check G2A for keys with a discount price. G2A makes it very easy to check what is available in your area and also to check which of the sellers are the most trustworthy. Link is in the description if you want to check it out. So the word fae, fairy, and fairy all basically come from the same word. The word fae comes from the Latin fata, meaning the fates, and fairy is just fae with the suffix airy, And airy is an old French suffix that we still see in other English words today, like chivalry or prairie. So fae and fairy are basically the same word, just one has the French suffix to it. Oui, oui. So fae and fairy are pretty much the same word because however much you may not like it, the English have borrowed a lot of words from the French. And the word elf basically just comes from Northern European words for fae-like beings. Elver in Swedish, alfer in Old Norse, and alp in German. So basically it all means the same thing. But what does fae mean? Well, can kind of mean anything. The concept of fae does not have any single origin. It's something that has existed in folklore from many, many different cultures. In early folklore, the word fae could refer to any kind of creature from fairyland, including pixies, goblins, gnomes, will-o-wisps, Kate Sith, trolls, etc. Some fae are really beautiful, others are ugly and grotesque. Some were mean and dangerous, like the Anglo-Scottish redcaps that dye their hats with blood, or the beautiful Irish Aoife that will kidnap you if you insult them. Others were benevolent, like the Scottish brownies, who were kind of like helpful house spirits. And many different cultures had their own versions of these humanoid magical beings that come from an other world, like the Peri in Persian mythology, the Irish Aoife, the Greek nymphs, and the German elves. But nowadays when we use the word fae, we're usually no longer referring to the uglier type of fae like goblins and gnomes. But that is what it started out as an umbrella term. So basically, fae folklore is kind of a mess, and many different time periods, different cultures just changed and rewrote the folklore over and over again. So there's not really one way to do it, and you can very clearly see this in the way like modern fantasy books write about fae. If we just look at like 4 popular fae fantasy books that I've read and their world building, you're gonna see it's chaos. Let's start with the Iron Fae. This was a YA fantasy series that I was obsessed with when I was like 40 years old, about a girl who finds out that she is half fae and goes to the fae world. This is the world building in that series. So there's a summer court called Arcadia for the Seelie Fae, ruled by Queen Titania. And then there's a winter court called Tirnanoch for the Unseelie Fae, ruled by Queen Mab. The idea of a Seelie and Unseelie court among the Fae has its origins in Scottish folklore. Tirnanoch is an Irish Celtish otherworld. Arcadia is a Renaissance term for utopia. Titania and Mab are both Shakespearean characters, one from Romeo and Juliet and the other from A Midsummer Night's Dream. It is thought that the idea of the seasonal courts originated in the Victorian era. But also another book with this exact same concept of a summer and a winter court ruled by Queen Titania and Queen Mab also appears in Jim Butcher's fantasy series, The Dresden Files, in his 2002 novel Summer Nights. And it could also be that this series popularized the idea that fae live in these seasonal courts ruled by Shakespearean royals. And that this had like a massive influence on how later fantasy authors wrote their fairy kingdoms. And the last thing I want to say about the Iron Fae is that Julie Kagawa also added a lot of her own lore to it, notably the Iron Kingdom ruled by Queen Machina. The second fae book that I read when I was younger was Wings, another YA fantasy series about a young girl who finds out that she's a fae changeling. In this world, the Fae Kingdom is called Avalon, which is a reference to the King Arthur myths. The Fae also are divided into these seasonal courts, summer, winter, spring, and fall. And the author Aprilyn Pike adds her own lore to it, specifically that in this series, the Fae are plants. And they do like photosynthesis. Then we have A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas about a human girl that is abducted and kidnapped to the Fae Kingdom. There's also the seasonal court, but on top of like the summer, winter, autumn, spring, there's also the dawn court, the night court, and the day court. And in ACOTAR, actually most of the Fae lore is originally created by Sarah J. Maas, or a combination of a lot of random mythologies. For example, the Bogi and the Martaks are her own original creations. Then the Naga is from Buddhist and Hindu myths. Picts are a Celtic tribe, and Urisks are Scottish Gaelic. And lastly, there is the Cruel Prince series by Holly Black, which also include courts, but they are not seasonal. Instead, she has the Court of Moths, the Court of Teeth, and the Court of Termites. The first queen of the fairy otherworld is also called Queen Mab, which is again from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. And for the inhabitants of fairyland, Holly Black is very clearly inspired by old Anglo-Scottish and Irish folklore. My point with this is to kind of make it clear that fae world building is generally kind of chaotic, takes inspiration from many different time periods and many different cultures, and most authors also add their own spin to it to varying degrees. I always thought that it was possible to write like folklore congruent fae stories, but there kind of isn't because there is no consistent folklore. And knowing this also makes it way more understandable that the image, the appearance of the fae is so subject to change, as we will see in the next section. If you told a Victorian fairy painter that nowadays the fae are kinda sexy, he would not be surprised, actually. But we'll get there. Let's start at the beginning. Like I said, early on, fae were folklore creatures, differing from city to city. There was no consensus on what a fae was. It could differ from anything from a household spirit to giants. And unsurprisingly, our boy Shakespeare had a massive influence on how the fae were perceived for multiple centuries. Unsurprisingly, Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream marked a turning point in representation of fairies. The play highlighted fairies' mischievous nature. It was this play too which put the diminutive fairy onto the national stage and into English literature. But when people started painting fairies, their image drastically started changing. The first fairy painter that we know of is probably William Blake, and he had a massive influence on how we perceive fairies. You can see there's a lot of nature inspiration. The fairies are dancing and prancing around. Again, in this painting by Henry Fuseli, these fairies do be dancing. They be silly. They be frolicking around like little tricksters. In this 1719 painter by Henry Fuseli of Queen Titania, you can see that they're still very human-like, but here we can see for the first time a detail where they have little butterfly wings. So when we think of fairies, like the small ones, you're probably thinking of them having these like little insect-like dragonfly wings. Now this idea of the fairy has nothing to do with original folklore. The idea of the fairy having little gossamer wings, it originated at the start of the 18th century in a poem called The Rape of Lock by Alexander Pope. Some of the sun their insects' wings unfold, transparent form too fine for mortal sight, their airy garments flow, while every beam new transient colors flings, colors that change whenever they wave their wings. And by describing the fairies like this, he is very clearly giving them insect-like attributes. Pope later refers to the fairies in his poems as denizens of air. I wonder if like the folk of the air, like the by Holly Black, comes from that, or if it's more like a general term. In 1789, an illustrated version of this poem came out, and in these illustrations we can very clearly see that the fairies are being represented having these insect-like wings. They also shrank in size from the Shakespearean 3 feet to something that could sit on a little flower. But it is the 19th century when the little insect-like fairy had just become kind of a thing, when the fairy hype truly reached its peak and just exploded. It took a while for the fairy craze to blow over from continental Europe to England, mostly because fairies were not an act of God. It was not Christian. It was very demonic. You were not allowed to talk about these like unholy, not in the Bible creatures. The Victorian era really is the era. Wow, they were in their fairy era. The Victorians were in their fairy era for real. But despite this Christian belief, the fairies did become extremely popular in England as well, and there are multiple reasons for this. First of all, Industrial Revolution. It's the reason for everything. People wanted a refuge into magical lands as a way to cope with the growing industrialization. A lot changed in Victorian England because of the Industrial Revolution and like the invention of photography. Quick breakthroughs in science and technology caused a lot of enchantment with the rapidly changing world, and people started turning to stories about fairies and magic to cope. The Romantics started collecting folk tales and going back to like old stories as inspiration for their own writing. Pretty much all of the major Romantics wrote at least one fairy-related poem. In fact, the word folklore itself was invented in 1846 by English antiquarian William Thoms to describe this new phenomenon. Folktales and fairy tales were also imported from continental Europe as translations. For example, the stories about fairies from the Brothers Grimm from Germany, and also Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales from Denmark. And because these fairy tales were written by Christian people, they were already kind of like chiller. I know we often say that like the Brothers Grimm fairy tales are like so much darker than the Disney fairy tales, but the original folklore tales were even darker, and in that time Brothers Grimm's fairy tales were like the nice Christian version of the old folk tales. And to add to all of this escapism, the Victorian era was also the time where a lot of people were obsessed with ghost stories and spirituality. There was an uptick in spirit sightings. People were having seances as a little hobby. Just doing my little seance with the boys, having a little spiritual awakening with the girlies. And fairies really fit into that belief in the spiritual. And the last thing, there was this growing nostalgia and romanticization of childhood. Think Lewis Carroll and his romanticization of childhood with Alice in Wonderland. And all of this together caused the fairy appearance to change. And we can see this in the very popular fairy paintings of the time. First of all, the stories were changed to adhere to Christian values. So fairy paintings would be about demure women and heroic men. No more disturbing tales of horrific creatures. Fairies were now beautiful, naked women. There were lots of nature themes. In this painting by Joseph Noel Paton, you can see that some are human-sized, some are small, some have these insect-like wings to them. In this painting by John Anster Fitzgerald, the fairies are clearly insect-like and tiny. A century later, the 20th century, the peak of like the fairy hype of Victorian era kind of started dying down a little bit. Fairies post-war became mostly associated with children's stories and children's postcards. It is this time period that the classic image of the flower fairy comes from. They were little girls with pointy hats and pointy shoes, or they were sitting in flowers. And because the fae art in the 20th century was completely directed towards children, they completely lost all of their edge of threat and sensuality. This also means that they lost their nakedness, because that's what the fae were in the Victorian era. Naked. Now, fairies have always been beautiful, although there has for a long time been this dichotomy between fair and foul fae. Especially the mischievous and mean ones like Robin Goodfellow or goblins were usually depicted as more grotesque. But many folktales and poems speak of beautiful fae. There are even very specific folktales about beautiful female and male fae that seduce men and women to steal them away. But the image of the naked fae is, against all expectations, very Victorian. More specifically, fairy paintings and stories were an outlet for topics and feelings repressed in Victorian society. For example, taking the chance to paint some nudes, even though the lack of clothes was never an inherent feature to fae in old folklore. Art historian Susan Casteras remarks that fairy paintings were more about flaunting nudity for its own sake rather than a supposedly accurate transcription of fairy lore. In any normal situation, this depiction of unclothed bodies was of course completely unacceptable in Victorian era England. But as long as you could justify it as folklore, you could do basically anything you wanted. As long as your nubile fairy women sported a set of iridescent wings, veiling them under a layer of myth, you could maintain an illusion of decorum and modesty. And Victorian painters seized that opportunity to paint some sensual pictures. For Victorian standards, of course. Simon Cooke writes about Richard Doyle's famous fairy paintings. There is also, startlingly, a strong emphasis on eroticism, especially in the images of fairies embracing, and on images of cruelty, in which wood elves pull the legs and wings of insects. Some fairy artists, like John Anster Fitzgerald, were speculated to get a lot of their inspiration from their alleged involvement in the opium dens. For example, look at this painting called The Stuff That Dreams Are Made Of. There's a lot of speculation that the stuff in question was, let's just say, not the same stuff that Hilary Duff was singing about when she said, "This is what dreams are made of." And a lot of the dreaminess of his paintings are said to refer to his hallucinations. And this trend of using fairies to talk about indecent topics wasn't exclusive to paintings. Maureen Duffy writes, in The Erotic World of Fairy, fairy tales allowed writers to deal with taboo subjects and taboo desires in an indirect way. Notably, women were allowed to freely write about whatever they wanted as long as it happened in a children's fairy story. Terry Windling, author and editor in the field of fantasy literature and fairy tale historian, writes, "Yet in the years when the children's books industry was still new, Victorian women had a freedom of expression unknown to the children's books writers of today. As long as their tales conformed outwardly to the conventions of popular children's fiction, they were able to populate their tales with extremely subversive characters and creatures, such as clever, hot-tempered female fairies and irascible, intractable heroines." It's interesting to see the purpose of fairies change over time. Like in original folklore, fairy stories existed to warn people about nature, to explain certain natural phenomenon. Like for example, bogies would be used to tell children to not go near lakes so they don't drown. But in the Victorian era, when nature didn't pose as much of a threat anymore, at least to the upper classes, there was no need for these warning tales anymore. Instead, fae stories were being used as vehicles for fantasies outside the norm of society. You could paint and write whatever you wanted. It was all protected under a layer of supernatural. And I wonder if this is like similar to the popularity of like the current fae. I don't want to be reductive and say like, oh, this is what happened in the Victorian era, so that must mean that that is exactly what's happening right now. I don't think that's the case, and there's probably many other factors. But am I incorrect when I say that the A Court of Thorns and Roses series introduced a lot of people to like romance fantasy books and spicy fantasy books? I wonder if the fact that they are fantasy books had a similar effect to the fae paintings in the sense that they were just folklore, where people, especially young women, would feel less shame around reading spicy books or even just romance books because they were fantasy books. Look at these discreet covers. There's nothing going on here at all. What are you talking about? Romance books have always had kind of a negative reputation. You know, they are shallow, frivolous, giving women too high expectations of men being nice to them. And especially if they have covers that look like this, a lot of people have shame around that. And granted, I don't think that the fae element is crucial here. Just the fantasy element itself, I think, would be enough. But I just think it's interesting, or, you know, like at best a funny coincidence that this is yet again happening with fae stories. And I like the idea that fae stories are being used to express hidden desires of the artists or authors. Looking at The Cruel Prince, which is, I think, my favorite modern fae fantasy book. It is young adult and not at all spicy at all. But the main character, Jude Duarte, is, to my knowledge, the first like singular YA female main character that was just unapologetically allowed to be mean, backstabbing, ambitious, not ruled by any standard moral compass. Like in The Cruel Prince, she kills, she betrays, she's not really interested in saving the kingdom, more so interested in saving herself. Young female main characters in young adult novels have for a long time always been nice and virtuous, except when it comes to killing. For some reason, killing has always been the one sin that female main characters were allowed to commit. Like, they were virgins, but also assassins? But these YA main characters were always clearly acting with like the future of the kingdom in mind and saving the world in mind. But Jude unapologetically acts in her own interests only because, well, it's fairyland. You kind of want to behave like that if you want to survive the Fae world. The Fae operate on a completely different moral set of values, so does Jude. Because it takes place in a fairy otherworld, where different moral rules apply, it's okay. Just like the Victorians used fairy paintings and fairy stories to express things that wouldn't fly in normal society. Okay, so we've established that Fae appearances change over time based on what they represent. They could be beautiful because they're trying to seduce you and steal you away. They could be pretty and tiny because it's more Christian than the demonic Fae from folklore. They could be naked because Victorians. They could be dancing and prancing around your bedroom because you're high on opiates. They could be children in little flower dresses because Fae stories and art were marketed purely towards children. What Fae look like constantly changes based on the whims of the artists. Now we've finally arrived to modern day Fae. Yes, of course, I skipped a lot of details in history because I'm trying to make a concise video. There's obviously way more. Sources are always in the description, but if you're thinking to yourself, why did you talk about this? It's because I'm trying to make a video under an hour. So our main question at the beginning of the video was, how did we get here? Why do they look this way in modern fantasy books? We now know that we can answer that question by looking at what the Fae represent in these modern fantasy books. So what I'm gonna do for the rest of this video is I'm gonna make a comparison between two of, I guess, the most popular Fae stories and series that I've personally read, The Cruel Prince and A Court of Thorns and Roses. I've said before that I'm personally a bigger fan of the Fae in The Cruel Prince than the Fae in A Court of Thorns and Roses. And I think it's a great example of how these two authors just crafted their Fae in different ways because they were trying to tell a different story. Okay, let us begin with The Cruel Prince. This is a YA fantasy story about a girl who grows up in fairyland after a fairy brutally kills her parents. Now, in interviews, Holly Black has always made it very clear that she likes to focus on the cruel part of the old folklore Fae that we sometimes forget about. But the original folklore is pretty brutal. Some fairies might steal people, trick people, lead them astray off cliffs and into the water where creatures will eat you. I love that this world is not about one being, but about a whole ecosystem of trolls and goblins and nixies and pixies and sprites and dozens of other creatures. And I love that they're a bit like nature itself, with the wildness and pitilessness of a storm, but also with the warmth of a lazy summer day. And you can tell that Holly Black has a lot of love for the Anglo-Scottish and Irish folklore. She's written 3 series about Fae so far and is currently on her 4th. She has a research resources page on her website with all fairy folklore sources. And she has a body modification to make her ears pointed like that of a Fae, which honestly is iconic. That is iconic behavior. I actually ordered Fae elf ears for filming today, but they didn't arrive on time, so we're not doing that. So, The Cruel Prince is her most popular work, and I would say that at its heart is a story about human versus Fae. About a human girl who is forced to navigate the otherness of the Fae world and who changes herself in the process. So what do the Fae in The Cruel Prince look like? They are all kinds. Pixies, imps, goblin, redcaps, etc. But most of the supporting characters as well as our love interest are part of the gentry. They are the attractive, most humanoid Fae, characterized by their beauty. But very importantly, they all still have very unhumanoid features. Like Jude's father is famously green. And people constantly comment about how they forget that he's green. And that was a conscious choice. The love interest in The Cruel Prince, Cardan, has a cow's tail. And the love interest in The Stolen Heir, which is kind of like the sequel to the Cruel Prince series, our love interest Oak has hooves. Like his entire underside of his body is that of a deer. And these are a reminder that they are not human. They may almost trick the reader and the main characters into believing that they are human with their beauty and therefore safe. But they're not. The animal traits serve as a stark reminder that they are not human and therefore unpredictable and dangerous, and different from our main character, Jude. Holly Black also includes very standard fae folklore traits in her faes, like they can't lie, they don't like iron, they will trick you, they have like a completely different set of moral rules. And again, this trait really highlights how different they are from humans and our main character. Now, if we compare this to the fae in A Court of Thorns and Roses, now, ACOTAR is about a girl named Farah who accidentally kills a fairy and as punishment has to live with the fae. Sarah J. Maas herself has said that the story is inspired by the folktale of Tam Lane, a story about a young man stolen away by fairies to become a knight, and she is also said to be inspired by East of the Sun, West of the Moon, which is a fairy tale about a girl that marries a bear who turns out to be a beautiful prince. Sarah J. Maas is generally very inspired by fairy tales. Not only is ACOTAR also a Beauty and the Beast retelling, her first series, Throne of Glass, was originally also a Cinderella retelling. Now, in ACOTAR, the fae are also dangerous and scary, but in my experience of reading the book, this series focuses a lot more on the magic and enchantment of entering the fae world. And most importantly, also the romance. Like, Farah is treated way better by the fae than by her original human family. And we can see this in the way that Sarah J. Maas has designed her fae. First of all, her fae lack the classic fae attributes like that they can't lie, etc. And the explanation given in the book is that fae just made up these lies about themselves so that, for example, humans would just always believe that fae told the truth. And I think this lack of like classic folklore fae characters adds to the escapism of the book. As a reader, you don't know anything about the fae. Everything you thought that you knew about fae turns out to not be real, though you are more in the same shoes as our main character Farah, who is discovering this fae world for the first time, learning everything about it for the first time, completely from scratch, because the fae world of Sarah J. Maas mostly consists of things that Sarah J. Maas came up with herself. Now, the most striking thing to me about Sarah J. Maas's fae is that they are divided into two kinds. There are lesser fae and high fae. This is what I found on the wiki. The high fae differ from the lesser fae by their human-looking appearances, save for their delicately arched ears and long limbs. Any other difference will mark a fairy as lesser fairies. Often lesser fae have strange traits that make them very far from the human likeness of the high fae. For example, colorful skin or like glowing skin. So the less human the fae, the lower they are on the hierarchy. Most of the supporting characters and of course our love interest are all high fae and therefore the most human-like. So Sarah J. Maas's goal, unlike Holly Black's goal, seems to not at all other the fae from humans. And the few ways in which the fae do differ from humans all aid the romance potential of the book. For example, the high fae are stronger than humans, more beautiful than humans. They have magic. The most animalistic trait about them is that they have mates and form mating bonds. Even the love interests that have bat-like wings, which I would say is a very animalistic trait, somehow still doesn't make them lesser fae. And these wings are also sensitive, if you know what I mean. I will say that Sarah J. Maas does attribute certain animalistic traits to her characters, or especially her love interest, because her love interests are famously always growling and purring and stalking like animals. She also always emphasizes that these fae are not men and women, but male and female. But I have an inkling that she's not doing this to other the fae from humans, but for other romantic related reasons, you know. I don't know, maybe I'm giving it the wrong interpretation, but I don't think I'm wrong. Basically, all of the fae traits that Sarah J. Maas's fae do have make them more eligible bachelors. And this fits the main goal of the series, to be this escapist fantasy story with a very strong romance plotline. If I were to compare the Cruel Prince fae to the ACOTAR fae in one sentence, it would be that ACOTAR's fae are superhuman, whereas the Cruel Prince fae are not human. And this also instantly sums up the difference in theme between these two book series. I do want to mention here that I'm a big Cruel Prince fan, but not really a fan of ACOTAR, and that may like bias my analysis of the situation. So I would love to know from ACOTAR fans if you guys would agree when I say that ACOTAR is more about the romance and the magic rather than about showing how dangerous the fae are. What I learned while researching this video is that there's no one way to write a fae story. There's no one correct way to represent them. Fae are the ultimate magical beings that the artist and authors can shape and mold to fit the story that they want to tell, to fit whatever they want to express. We've moved on to the 20th century idea that fae are something for children and only for children, and nowadays, like, fae can be the cute little pixie type, they can be cruel and scary, they can be attractive and a little sexy. Next time I'm reading a fae book, I'm gonna pay extra attention to how the author creates the appearance of the fae and creates the world building around the fae, because it probably says a lot about the kind of story that they're trying to tell. I hope you liked this extreme deep dive into fae. I think this is one of the longest and most researched trope deep dives I've ever done, but I really enjoyed doing it. And definitely let me know what you think, and if you have other topics that you would like me to do a little deep dive into, do let me know. I'm moving my arms a lot just so I can show you that I have these sleeves that I'm in love with. If you enjoy talking to me about books, you can subscribe to the channel. And I want to end by thanking all of my patrons with a very special shout out to all of the Elite Hidden Library members, and a warm welcome to my newest Elite Hidden Library members, Ray Ellen and Alex. Welcome! If you want to join the Patreon, in which I have a monthly book club and monthly hangouts, I will leave the link in the description. That being said, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Can't wait to talk to you guys about it in the comments, and I will see you soon with another video next week. Goodbye!